Okay, let's dive in. Food. It's the most basic human need imaginable, right?
Absolutely. It really is.
Yet, here we are, world produces plenty of food, and somehow, hunger, undernourishment,
hmm
they still affect huge numbers of people, especially in developing countries.
It's a real paradox, and it highlights some massive global challenges. I mean, we see enough food in total, but for millions, the reality is scarcity, lack of access.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty stark.
They are. Estimates suggest what, around 13% of people in developing nations are undernourished?
13%. That's
Yes.
it's an enormous number of people struggling
Yeah.
every single day.
hmm
And it's not like the challenge is standing still, is it? Population keeps growing.
Exactly. Projections say food production needs a huge jump, maybe 60, 70%, possibly even double by 2050, just to keep pace.
Oh, double.
It really brings us back to this tension that people have talked about for centuries.
I mean, the Malthus idea?
Yeah, the paper touches on that historical context, that classic Malthusian idea from, the late 1700s, that population growth would just inevitably outstrip food production.
Right.
So this research kind of revisits that core tension, but throws a massive amount of modern data at it to see how it's playing out today.
So we've got this huge problem, this historical shadow, a massive challenge coming up. And our source for this deep dive is this really fascinating research paper looking right at this food security in developing nations.
Exactly. And our mission today is really to unpack the key insights from this paper. It looks at the complex link between agriculture and undernourishment.
Gets into the weeds a bit.
Yeah, it tries to figure out why food insecurity looks different in different places. And critically, what tailored strategies the research actually suggests might be most effective.
Okay. Now, what makes this paper's approach different? Because, developing countries isn't one single thing. How did they handle that diversity?
Ugh, that's where it gets really interesting. Instead of just lumping all developing countries together, the researchers used a pretty sophisticated clustering method.
Clustering.
Yeah. They took 100 of the developing countries most affected by undernourishment and grouped them statistically based on shared characteristics, things like, their agricultural situation, their undernourishment levels.
So they build different profiles for groups of countries to understand that the reasons for food insecurity aren't the same everywhere.
Precisely. The core idea is if the problems are different, then the solutions absolutely have to be different too. One size fits all just won't cut it here.
Makes sense. Okay, so they created these clusters. What specific things did they actually look at to build these profiles? It wasn't just about how much farmland a country has, right?
Oh, far from it. They looked at a whole range of key indicators, went much deeper than just land area.
Like what?
Well, obviously, the prevalence of undernourishment itself. That's the main measure of the problem, right? The percentage of people not getting enough food.
Okay, the outcome measure. And land. Was that still in there?
Oh, yeah. They looked at arable land per person. That's kind of the classic Malthusian variable, How much crop-suitable land per person gives you a basic sense of potential domestic supply versus need.
But they also brought in the economics, I assume.
Absolutely essential. They factored in how much agriculture contributes to the country's GDP.
And why does that matter?
Well, a high share can sometimes mean a heavy reliance on low productivity farming, maybe widespread rural poverty, while a low share might mean the country depends more on other sectors like oil or tourism.
Right. And what about the farming itself? Not just the land area, but how it's used.
Critical point. They analyze the percentage of arable land that's irrigated.
Ah, water access.
Exactly. It speaks volumes about reliability, especially with iffy rainfall. And they looked at the balance of agri-food trade. Are they net importers or exporters of food?
Okay, because being heavily dependent on imports could make you vulnerable.
Definitely. Big time.
Okay, so land, economics, irrigation, trade, anything else major?
Two more really important ones. First, the value of capital invested in agriculture per hectare.
What does that mean exactly?
Think of it as a proxy for how modern or equipped their farms are. Machinery, storage, technical stuff. Low value means less tech, less efficiency, harder to scale up.
Less horsepower behind the farmers, basically.
Yeah, got it. And finally, they directly tackled that Malthusian tension again. The gap between how fast food production is growing versus how fast the population is growing.
Ah, the race between production and population.
Right. If production isn't keeping up, you're in trouble, almost regardless of how much land you have initially. So by looking at this whole mix, physical, economic, productivity factors, they could build a much, much more nuanced picture.
And the big takeaway message from doing all that detailed clustering.
The absolute confirmation that these countries face incredibly diverse food security challenges. The paper really hammers home that trying to apply one single solution across the board, it's just, well, it's destined to fail.
Okay, so the problems are different. Did the analysis show what kinds of problems? Like, did they find one main reason for hunger, or did it split?
Yeah, digging into the results, the paper found basically two fundamental categories for why food insecurity is happening across these different clusters.
Okay, what are they?
One is rooted in the physical and and economic unavailability of food. Just food isn't there or people can't get to it financially. This seemed particularly strong in clusters with countries from parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeastern Asia.
So either the food literally isn't grown or imported enough, or people just plain can't afford it, even if it is physically present.
Precisely, that physical or economic barrier. The other major category they identified relates more to social inequalities in nutrition.
Inequalities. How so?
This was a key driver in clusters that didn't necessarily have a physical shortage overall, but where, large parts of the population couldn't access nutritious food because of disparities within the society. This showed up in clusters with, say, oil producers or small island tourist economies.
That's a really critical distinction. Unavailability versus unequal access. Okay, so based on these different profiles, these different root causes,
Right.
what kinds of tailored strategies did the paper suggest for the clusters? Can we group them maybe by their main challenge?
Right. Good idea.
Right?
One big group consists of what the paper terms import-reliant economies. These are in clusters I through 4.
What defines them?
Typically, a very low share of agriculture in their GDP, often because their economy runs on oil revenue, tourism, maybe transit fees. They tend to have pretty significant food trade deficits.
Meaning they buy way more food from abroad than they grow and sell.
Exactly. So their food security really hinges to a large extent on their ability to pay for those imports. Their financial ability to trade is paramount,
So the key strategy for them is,
centered around trade policy, specifically enhancing trade openness, making it easier, more efficient to import the food they need.
is it only about importing, though? Do they just give up
Yeah.
on domestic farming?
No, not entirely. They also need strategies tailored to maximize their specific, even if it's limited, agricultural potential.
For instance,
Well, in the Arab countries in these clusters, it might mean adopting innovative tech, maybe protected agriculture, hydroponics, and providing really targeted support for farmers working in tough conditions. For the island or transit economies, it's about squeezing the absolute most out of very limited land. Think intensive, high-value crops, and investing in the infrastructure to support that, even if it's small scale.
okay, so trade openness plus smart targeted use of whatever domestic potential they have. Makes sense. What about the countries where agriculture is a much bigger slice of the economic pie, but they're still struggling with high undernourishment?
Ah, that covers a very large and diverse group. The paper identifies these as facing productivity and capital deficit challenges. These span clusters 6 through IX and also, importantly, cluster 11.
Where are these countries typically?
All over, really, across Africa, Asia, Latin America, many with very large populations. They often have, relatively significant amounts of arable land, but they face big barriers to using it effectively.
What kinds of barriers?
A major one is that low value of capital invested per hectare we talked about. Remember the measure of farm equipment and tech? It's very low. They lack modern machinery, technology, decent storage.
Infrastructure gaps, too.
Huge ones, especially irrigation. That's a massive constraint, makes them super vulnerable to droughts, unreliable rain. And critically, their food production growth often lags way behind their population growth.
So they might have the land, but not the tools, not the reliable water, or not the rapidly improving yields needed to keep up with feeding more people.
That's the core of it, yeah. And undernourishment levels in this group can be tragically high. Cluster XC, for instance, shows almost 40% undernourishment.
40%, wow. That really puts the scale of the challenge into perspective for that group.
Okay.
So for them, what's the recommended path forward?
Here, the main focus really has to shift to dramatically boosting domestic production. Investments in agricultural infrastructure are vital, especially expanding and improving irrigation. That's number one for many.
And beyond infrastructure.
They need to accelerate production through technology adoption. Investing in agricultural research, developing better, higher-yielding crop varieties suited to their local conditions, and, crucially, improving extension services and training programs.
Extension services, just quickly, what are those again?
Ah, good point. Extension services are basically the link between the researchers and the farmers on the ground. They provide training, advice, help farmers learn about and actually use new techniques, new seeds, better practices. Getting that knowledge out there is absolutely key.
Right, so infrastructure, tech, research, farmer support. That's the toolkit for that big group.
Pretty much. Although the paper also notes that even for this group focused on domestic production, some might still benefit from targeted food imports, maybe under preferential trade agreements. It's not always either.
Okay. Now, there was one cluster you mentioned that sounded particularly tricky. Cluster X. High agricultural GDP, but also very high undernourishment. What's going on there?
Yeah, this cluster, including places like Liberia, Sierra Leone, it's really distinct, and it highlights a critical, sometimes overlooked point.
Which is?
The paper suggests that a very high share of agriculture in GDP in these specific cases often means that the huge chunk of the population working in farming is doing so at extremely low income levels.
Ah, so lots of farmers, but they're very poor.
Exactly. They don't have resources to invest in their own farms, and the general population just doesn't have the purchasing power to buy enough food, even if it were available. They also suffer from the same issues as the previous group: very low capital, low irrigation, not enough production, trade deficits.
So just making the farms technically more productive won't automatically solve the hunger problem there, if people can't afford the food anyway.
That is the absolute critical insight from this cluster. The paper argues pretty strongly that for countries like these, policies focused only on boosting farm productivity and infrastructure. Well, they're necessary, but they will not be sufficient.
So what else is needed?
You must also directly tackle poverty and find ways to increase consumers' economic access to food, basically, boost their ability to afford it.
And that point about income and access needing money to buy food, is that just for Cluster X or is it broader?
Oh, it's much broader. The paper really emphasizes this. Measures to reduce income inequalities and increase households' purchasing power, especially in rural areas, are key drivers for improving food access across many of these country types, not just Cluster X. It's crucial for those productivity and capital deficit clusters, VI3 and I too.
It really flips the script, doesn't it, from just thinking we need to grow more food to we need people to be able to get the food.
Exactly. National availability is one piece, but household level access, which is so tied to income, that's the other, equally vital piece.
What about countries that are doing relatively better, maybe already producing surpluses? You mentioned a cluster V.
Right. For countries in that group, like Malaysia, Costa Rica, places that already have higher agri-food surpluses, the focus is different. It's more about reinforcing their strengths, pushing efficiency further. Strategies involve things like continued technology transfer, implementing high-yielding varieties where it makes sense, increasing cropping intensity, getting more harvest per year from the same land, ensuring really efficient support services, and strong extension programs to keep driving productivity up and maintain that high food availability, basically building on their success.
This study just paints such a complex picture. It's not just farming, is it? It's economics, infrastructure, trade, tech, and people's ability to earn a living.
Absolutely. It's all deeply interconnected.
Let's just step back for a second. Remember we started talking about that historical Malthusian idea, population outstripping food supply, land being the limit. How did this study's findings speak to that old tension?
It offered a really interesting kind of nuanced update. While Malthus really zeroed in on the scarcity of land as the ultimate brake on food production,
Yeah.
this research found that actually in the modern context of these developing countries, factors like irrigation levels, the agri-food trade balance, and especially that value of capital stock, the level of investment in farm technology and assets, these were often more important in determining the actual nutrition situation than just the simple amount of arable land per person.
So land still matters, but it's not the only, or maybe even the main constraint anymore.
Exactly. It's still a factor, yes, but maybe not the dominant one compared to these other elements that really drive productivity and access in today's world.
That's a pretty powerful update to a, 200-year-old idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so given all this complexity, the tailored needs, the critical role of things beyond just land, what's the paper's message for, say, the international community trying to help tackle global hunger?
The paper stresses that, yes, significant international involvement is needed, but it needs to be smart involvement. Development assistance should really target the root causes that this analysis identified within each specific country cluster.
Like?
like addressing the lack of capital, fixing the infrastructure deficits, facilitating knowledge and technology transfer, focusing on those underlying issues rather than just, treating the symptoms by providing food aid.
So food aid has its place, but it's not the long-term fix.
Exactly. It's crucial in emergencies, absolutely. But it doesn't solve the underlying structural problems that cause the chronic hunger in the first place.
And the ultimate conclusion the paper draws, the overall path forward.
It really comes down to sustainable development and economic growth being the necessary foundations. But, and this is the key point, that development absolutely has to be rigorously tailored. Tailored to each country's unique mix of environmental, social, economic, political, and institutional realities.
So no single master plan.
Definitely not. It requires country-specific strategies that address the specific bottlenecks identified for each cluster. That's the way to ensure food security at all levels, from the nation right down to the individual household.
It feels like this study gives us a really solid data-driven way to understand why hunger persists differently in different places and suggests, targeted levers we can pull. Does the paper mention any limitations to its own approach?
Yes, it does, and that's important context. They're clear that this is largely a static snapshot. The data is mostly from around 2016-2018.
So it doesn't capture how things change quickly.
Right. It doesn't fully capture dynamics over time or the often devastating impact of sudden external shocks, things like, wild swings in global food prices, major climate events like droughts or floods, political instability. Those can change the picture dramatically very fast.
Cool. Anything else?
It also focuses more on the availability and economic access sides of things, and maybe less on the deeper human health and specific nutritional outcomes beyond just the basic measure of undernourishment prevalence. So it's a hugely valuable piece of the puzzle, provides a great framework, but it's not the final word on the incredibly complex and dynamic reality of food insecurity.
Okay, so if we boil it down, the fundamental takeaway from this deep dive seems crystal clear. Solving undernourishment in developing countries. It's just not a simple case of grow more food.
Not at all. It's this multifaceted challenge, deeply linked to agricultural potential, yes, but also critical infrastructure like irrigation, adopting technology, smart trade policies, and maybe most crucially, people's actual economic ability to get hold of the food.
And because the barriers are so different from place to place.
Effective strategies must be tailored. They have to fit the specific circumstances of different groups of countries. That's the core message.
That complexity is really striking. And, considering how critical the study found income and purchasing power to be in so many different places, it really makes you think beyond just national borders, doesn't it? Like, how might global economic policies or international trade deals, or even choices that consumers or governments make in, say, divergent countries, how might those things indirectly ripple out and affect the ability of vulnerable families far away to actually access the food they need? Definitely something to keep mulling over.